Should I begin?
Yes, so let me just introduce you very quickly. Now we will be hearing our fifth speaker, Justin Lynch, who's a researcher and co-author of the book, Sudan's Unfinished Democracy. Thank you so much, Justin, for being here with us, and the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you very much for having me and for the introduction. It's really an honor to be on this panel as well. I wanted to talk about the protest movement in Sudan, where it started, which I think informs where we could go. There have been a lot of critiques about the current mediation process, that it is not centered on civilians. And so I think that I wanted to speak about where the protest movement went in 2019 and the current state of the resistance committees. And if there's one point that I would like to make, and I'll keep coming back to, it's that grassroots organizations like the Sudan Professionals Association that really led the protests, and the resistance committees, when they're tasked with political bargaining, it really changes the structure of them, and it presents new challenges for these organizations. And I think that we need to recognize what those challenges will be and what the effects of this political bargaining process will be on these organizations. So to start, I wanted to talk about the Sudan Professionals Association, which was really one of the groups that was, had the one of the most leadership during the protests in 2019. And so, I think interestingly, it started off as a movement very specific and very targeted, that was really to raise the minimum wage in Khartoum, right? So it was a very urban organization at first, and it was an organization that had a focus on really the upper middle class of the Khartoum neighborhoods. And I think that this really specific objective gave its members a very clear vision of how to organize themselves. And the members were very motivated to be part of this organization, right? This kind of wasn't a fluid membership. This was a very motivated group that was part of the SPA. And so, what happened in December 2018 was spontaneous protests that took place, and the organization really had a decision to make. And they changed their goals from one that was focused on minimum wage to one that would take down the Omar al-Bashir regime. And so I think that when the SBA was first created, and the kind of broad protest movement was created, it was an incredibly flat structure in terms of organizational hierarchy. And it gave the organization a big advantage when it came to trying to, topple a dictator, because, a dictator's tactic when it comes to preventing a protest movement against them is really to kind of pay off the leaders, to buy off the leaders, to make political bargaining with the leaders, or to try and eliminate the leaders through either repression or through other means. And the fact that, that the SPA, like so many other protest movements throughout history, have a grassroots structure, is because it means that it is nearly impossible to stop the leadership, right? Because the leadership is very weak, right? So what that means is that there is a broad support, and it's very spontaneous. Of course, this is very difficult to build up, and this process, was, we have to be honest in that it was supported by years and years of trial and error that started in 2012, if you kind of look back at the kind of movement for how the SBA began. And so, the kind of key success for the SBA was the April 5th call in 2019 to call on soldiers to remove al-Bashir, right? So it took al-Bashir's key pillar of power, which was his military, and it turned that against him, right? This is what Gene Sharp would call political jujitsu, right? Where you use a regime's biggest tools and you strip it from them, right? You strip their biggest pillar of power. And so I think that, once the SBA and the Sudan protest movement, their goal was never just to remove Bashir. Their goal was to remove the entire system, right? And they made a critical decision at that point to negotiate with the military and to enter into negotiations. And so the SBA decided that the Forces of Freedom and Change would kind of take on that negotiation and that leadership role. And so broadly, what you saw was a movement that was very grassroots led, starting to take on a leadership structure, right? The kind of scaffolding of leadership that is necessary for political bargaining, right? And what you saw was an SBA and a broader protest movement that really struggled with that shift from being a grassroots movement to one that had a political leadership, right? I remember speaking with so many members of the SBA during this transitional period, and they disagreed with what their own leaders in the SBA and in the FFC were doing, because they felt like they were selling out the revolution, right? Or the leaders of these two movements felt like, look, this is the best offer that we can get, right? And so you could start to see the divisions within the SBA and within the protest movement at that point, between the leaders who were tasked with bargaining and the protesters who were very idealistic, and who wanted to continue to take on the broader regime that Omar al-Bashir had created. And I think this tension, right, this shift and this challenge that Sudan's protest movement had, turning from a grassroots organization to one that had to do political bargaining, is one that you see, it's not unique to Sudan. This is, a case of, political science. You saw it in Egypt during 2011, where, protesters from this very flat structure struggled to build more of a leadership structure. You saw this in Otpor in Serbia in the 2000s, where, this student movement had toppled Milosevic, but then struggled to, I don't think they even were, they didn't get past the electoral barrier during the first parliamentary elections that took place a year later. And so, throughout history, you can see how these organizations struggle to build the political leadership necessary. And so I wanted to talk a bit about the rise of the resistance committees. And I think that, the kind of, as the SBA started to have this infighting, the resistance committees became more prominent. And they are, loosely affiliated, neighborhood groups that provide essential services really on the local level and really on the ground. And so, they are even much more grassroots than the SBA was. And, a main feature of the resistance committees has been opposition to the continued role of the military in politics, and of the political status quo in general in Khartoum, right? But I think that it's important, to note as well that the resistance committees take on a different dimension outside of Khartoum, right? I remember meeting a lot of the resistance committee members in El Janina in West Darfur, and they were really, youth groups who had, who were affiliated based on their tribal identity. And there were, different resistance committees for the different tribal groups in every city, right? And so it wasn't based on kind of the shared principles that we associate with the resistance committees in Khartoum, but they were more closely, they could more accurately be defined really as kind of youth groups. And so I think that one of the things that, I think as researchers and as, practitioners and as journalists, we need to do is do a better job of really understanding the resistance committees and taking them at face value, and really studying them in a way that is much more in depth than I think some of the superficial work. And I think that, there are so many great Sudanese writers, Muzan Al-Nil had a great piece the other day. And I think we need more of this type of research to really get to the grassroots I shouldn't say grassroots, the real understanding of the resistance committee members, because there were so many contradictions and interesting facets that we have not yet really grappled with publicly about the resistance committees. I think that, when I speak and, with so many resistance committee members today, and in the past, they were very clear that they do not want to get involved in politics. And I think this is a really important question. And what I mean by that is that, they do not want to become politicians themselves, right? The resistance committees, in many ways, want to hold politicians to account, and they see themselves as kind of above politics. And I think it's a really interesting viewpoint that we need to understand more. And I kind of explain it as a lot of the resistance committee members have seen opposition politicians, really sell themselves and negotiate compromise with the Sudanese regime throughout their whole lifetime. And so they also have seen that being in politics is really dangerous, right? Both kind of personally, professionally, it gets them in trouble. And so I think that kind of resistance to get involved in, capital P politics is one that we need to kind of study more. But of course, the resistance committees at a grassroots level are extremely powerful in politics as it relates to grassroots activity, right? In terms of service delivery and a lot of the things that I think that, political parties would, really, kind of do, right? This kind of local service delivery. And so I think that is an issue that we need to study more. And I think one of the last points I want to make about the resistance committees is why in 2011, after the coup against Abdullah Hamdok and the civilian part of the transitional government, why protesters were unable to, prevent, why they were unable to return to a path of a true transition. And I think the difference, one of the key differences is that the resistance committees in 2021, they did not want to negotiate and compromise with the military, right? They believed that the military should abandon politics altogether. And this is a key distinction from the SBA in 2019, when they called on the military to perform a coup against Omar al-Bashir, right? Using the military's own power, which is the mid-level soldiers, the low-level soldiers, against it. And there was a key difference in those tactics there. And so, I think that is an important distinction for why the resistance committees might not have been successful in 2021, because we saw, huge protests after Hamdok was removed from office. And so, I think that as we, there are discussions about a peace, peace negotiation, mediation, and there have been discussions about the role of resistance committees and civil society in Sudan. We need to be honest, and we need to be, we need to understand that putting a political, that charging these groups with political bargaining will change them, and we need to anticipate that and also give them the support and time that they need to ensure that that it is successful if and when that happens. And so I think that what to do next. I think that the reality is that the international community, I think especially the West, has a limited ability to really stop the war in Sudan, I think, as the other panelists have said. But I think that, what it can try and prevent is its intensity and its spread to other countries. And I think key here is making sure that the war, stays in Sudan and it doesn't become a proxy conflict between Egypt and the UAE, which I think other panelists have spoke about as well. I think the two final points. One is that, in Washington, D.C. and in capitals in the West, the debate becomes about, sanctions or no sanctions. And I think, we need to make sure that our policy isn't characterized by just that question, right? We need to have a broader strategy beyond sanction or no sanctions, right? We have to be honest with the fact that, financial sanctions will be limited in their effectiveness, right? There have been sanctions on Sudan for 30 years. And many of these military companies, some of them face sanctions already. And so how effective will they be in actually stopping the war? I think that, will they have an impact? Maybe, right? We need to be honest about that. We don't have a certainty for how effective they will be, but we need to have a strategy beyond sanctions or no sanctions that we often see in the Sudans, right? And the last thing that I think we need to be realistic about as the war continues is the role of humanitarian aid and how it's going to affect the conflict. When I worked for the UN and for NGOs in Sudan, our community, we were really awful at stopping the politicization of aid by armed groups. And I think that the struggle, we really haven't seen the leadership from the humanitarian community, from the UN, and from OCHA on this issue and taking it seriously, right? There's a history of pledging to have a principled response to humanitarian aid and donors not following through on that. And I think this is, a very political issue. Although it is, one that is humanitarian, this is one that affects politics on the ground, because if you are in a conflict area, humanitarian aid really is a lot of your livelihood. And so I think that politicians need to be taking this seriously and make sure that it is not used for, to further entrench the political actors on the ground and the warring parties on the ground. And so I think with that, I will hand it over. And again, thank you for having me. Yeah.